Well, an email question here from Lucy. First of all, it says, what did Paul mean when he called himself chief of sinners? Who was James talking to when he said, wash your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded? I call my family and myself saints, but those two verses are unclear to me. That's great. Great question, Lucy, because we do often look at ourselves as sinners, and some people say it's humble to say, well, you're a sinner and a saint simultaneously. Well, what is the truth about how God sees you? How is it that God refers to you? Well, as you work your way through the New Testament epistles, you actually find that Paul is calling us saints, not sinners. And so the question is, well, what about when Paul called himself chief of sinners? Well, he was referring to when he killed Christians. He was referring to his track record in literally murdering church goers. I mean, saints. I mean, children of God from 2,000 years ago running around. His whole job was to stomp them out, or at least he thought. And so he referred to himself as chief of sinners in that context because here he was setting a world record for sin in his own mind, at least, because he was murdering God's children, God's people. So he saw that as heinous, as shockingly evil. And then for God to call him and use him as an apostle was just overwhelming to him. And that's the whole context of that passage where Paul calls himself chief of sinners. He's saying, I set a world record. I went beyond anyone else's sinning in that I killed believers. I sought them out. I stood by and gave hearty approval at the stoning of Stephen. So this is all referring to his former life and his former behavior and his former identity. Paul wouldn't say that he's a sinner now. He would say he's a saint, that he's born again, born of the Spirit, in the Spirit, child of God. That's why throughout the New Testament letters, when Paul refers to the Corinthians or the Ephesians or the Romans or whoever it might be, he says to the saints at Rome, to the saints at Corinth, to the saints at Ephesus. He sees us as holy ones, just as God sees us as holy and set apart forever for Him. So are we sinners by nature? Is that who we are? Well, if that were the case, then the new birth did nothing. If that were the case, then being born again is meaningless. If that were the case, then God taking out our heart of stone and giving us a new heart would really make no sense or have no significance. So the reality is that we are not sinners by nature anymore. We are children of God. We are holy and blameless and righteous. And it is certainly proper for us to think of ourselves as holy ones or saints who sometimes sin. Yes, we commit sins, but we are not what we do. We are not defined by our behavior. We are not the sum total of our track record. We are saints who sometimes sin. Well, in the passage that you refer to in James, when he says, wash your hands, you sinners, he's talking to people that are not yet they're not yet believers. They are unbelievers, that is. And the point there is that, they're double-minded. About what? About the identity of Jesus. They're double-minded about the gospel. They're double-minded about all that they're thinking, and so they're not on board yet, having to be cleansed. Well, that's a reference to the gospel itself. We are cleansed when we respond to the gospel message, aren't we? When we come to Jesus Christ for salvation, He cleanses us of all unrighteousness. So this is James talking to a Jewish community, many of whom are not believers, and that's really important to remember. So again, we want to look at ourselves as God sees us. This is not some sort of pride. It's actually real humility. Real humility is seeing yourself the same way God sees you, and He calls you a saint, a holy one.